So with that, I will transition to part three, a topic of great relevance in these days, right? So as many of us know, transportation is taking a big hit with COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to share some of our thoughts on one, the impacts from some of the analysis of the Uber data that we have done, but also on some thoughts on reopening of this transportation system. So it's no surprise that pretty much every city in all over the world has had seen significant changes in their ridership in the last few months, right? So this is just a summary of some of the major cities in the US. And if you see in January, even just as the pandemic was in the news, we see a small dip, really. I mean, some actually have increased, but a few about minus 0.3%. By February, you see not a significant change, but as soon as the lockdowns were announced in late March, right, you can see about significant 60, 40, 70%, like in San Francisco, about 70%, in Miami, about 50%. And that continued into April and May. And today it's slightly back, right? So for example, Miami is still about 52 instead of 55%. And so we see that an upward trend in the last few days, right? But transit has taken a big hit. And anyone who knows the history of how transit is funded in the US, right? This is a major blow for the transit, right? So it's not unlike other cities in the world, transit is not really well funded in the US. So this is a major impact, and we are still thinking about how to kind of look at policies to save transit. Same for airline traffic. Just in the early March, right, you can see these numbers pretty low, but the statistics show that about 90% of the air travel has reduced. Same for the cargo, about 40 to 50% reduction in terms of the cargo traffic, right? So in New York City, if you look at it by modes of transportation, so you can see that the density before COVID was this much for cars, pedestrians, and for cyclists, varying with the time of day. This x-axis is the time of day, right? So you can see some peaks, but as soon as the pandemic was there, 15th April, 27th May, you can see that there's significant reduction in terms of this density of travels for even cars, pedestrians, and cyclists in New York City. A lot of variability in cyclists here. That's something I want you to note. A lot of people are actually much more comfortable cycling recently, right? Because it also provides some exercise, and people also can go make short trips with this mode of transportation. This is data from India using Apple data. And so you can see that there's been a significant drop, about 70 to 80% drop, but again, picking up in June, late June, it's actually picking up, both walking as well as driving trips. Same thing for US data here using Apple. Transit still not recovering as much as we want to see, but walking and driving is almost back up to what we had before pre-COVID. So this is our analysis from the FHV data. So we have collected data in March from Uber trips, and we have analyzed the impacts of Uber trips in New York City. And we wanted to see what is the impact in terms of the Uber, if the number of pickups have dropped, are there any changes in terms of airport pickups and so on, right? So this is the aggregate level statistics. So this is when there was a talk about the stay-at-home order. This is when the stay-at-home order started. So you can see that as after that, there's almost 60% drop in FHV trips in the entire New York City. So this blue line is 2019, and this is red line is 2020. So you can see the significant drop that is there in terms of the number of vehicles. So this shows the cruising time. The cruising time per vehicle is actually higher during the pandemic as compared to when there's no pandemic, right? So people, the taxi drivers are searching more, whereas the cruising area really has not changed. So they're still drivers are still kind of going in the same areas and trying to pick up. So they're still traveling the same distances, but most of the distance is empty trips, right? So empty miles have increased. So this is a visualization of this COVID-19 FHV trips. And here you can see this is non-COVID, same time period, 2019. This is COVID 2020, New York City. And you can see that the heat map is not as red as you would see during the non-COVID days in 2019. There's a lot of activity. You'll be surprised to see there's a lot of activity still in some hubs like the JFK here and LaGuardia here, and we can quickly discuss why that is so. And that's actually shown here as well, that the shares in Manhattan, if you remember our earlier slide, 70 to 80% of the traditional taxis are in Manhattan, and same for these Uber types of trips. So that has actually decreased because Manhattan had a big hit in terms of this COVID, while the shares of Bronx and Brooklyn pretty much actually increases because these taxi drivers are actually looking for trips wherever they can. And so they're actually going into Bronx and Brooklyn more to kind of find these trips. Similarly, you see that the airports, JFK and LaGuardia, actually the shares in 2020 are higher than 2019. Looks counterintuitive, right? But once you look at the data closely, what is happening here is these are not loaded trips. They don't really have passengers, but because they know that there are a lot of passengers that they can actually potentially find at these hubs, all the drivers are actually going towards those locations. So you see that spike here in terms of the trips to the JFK airport, much higher than what they were in 2019. But that doesn't mean all of them are actually loaded trips, right? So most of them are actually empty trips and empty miles. So I would like to kind of share with you some thoughts on how to reopen the urban transit systems, right? So different cities have kind of come up with different policies. For example, in New York, the city has said that we need to look at alternate forms of transportation, which really do not bring people close to one another. So we need to look at e-mobility, e-scooters, and e-bikes as one potential solution. Paris, the streets are kind of turned into temporary bike lanes. China, Didi has used about the robo-taxis. Then Singapore, they have used this self-check-in kiosks for public transportation. And Japan has also considered this travel bubbles where they do the screening before people travel and quarantine them and so on, right? So different cities have come up with different solutions. So my key message today is while there are a lot of benefits of MaaS, there are also externalities like congestion, energy, and emissions, which we can quantify. Two, there are human impacts, and especially on the vulnerable population, which we need to look at and we can quantify them. And we need to look at good incentives and policies for considering equity rather than just system optimization. And we need to look at this COVID-19 impacts carefully and come up with a holistic solution to reopen the transportation systems. So finally, I would like to end my presentation with potential collaborations that we could develop with ADBI and ADB. So in the smart city space, we would like to kind of explore this impact assessment of particularly in Asian cities as to how these inequalities kind of play out and what are the externalities that are there due to this smart mobility. Especially we need to look at this entire ecosystem and how do we do financing for these kind of technologies considering these holistic impacts. Then second, we want to look at e-mobility and its impact in Asia. A lot of interest in India, developing countries like India and Indonesia, where there's nexus of electricity with mobility, like solar and wind and battery. Then looking at financing and insurance options, like autonomous transportation is going to change the insurance industry. And how do we kind of do more user-based insurance rather than a more location-based insurance as a whole? Urban logistics and trade impacts, and then anything related to COVID and impacts on transportation. And how do we make this transit system more resilient to these kind of shocks in the future, right? So these are some kind of problems I put in there, both for our discussion and potentially for future collaborations. So these are some of our partnerships that we work with. I would like to acknowledge them. We work with various funding agencies which provide funding for our work, including agencies, some of the foundations, and some private companies like Ford and Yahoo Japan and data providers. So I'd like to acknowledge their contributions. I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborators, my students on this work. So at the end of this presentation, there's some references of our work. And yeah, I would like to kind of stop here. And I would like to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you very much.